The light was fading, a process Brother Elias knew intimately. It was not a sudden vanishing act, but a slow, deliberate withdrawal, a long, whispered adieu from the day. He stood in the western edge of the Abbey garden, his posture as rooted and still as the old cedar tree beside him, and watched the evening unfold. St. Jude's Abbey stood perched on the high, gray cliffs overlooking the sea. It was a place known more for its quietude than its size, a sanctuary built not against the world, but simply apart from it, where the loudest sounds were the rhythm of the waves and the sigh of the wind through the pines. Brother Elias was the Abbey's keeper of the ground, a title he'd worn for nearly 50 years. His hands, gnarled and sun-weathered, knew the texture of the soil better than they knew the feel of soft cloth. Today, his task was finished. The last row of late-season chamomile had been turned and the gate to the lower fields secured. Now, all that remained was the sacred ritual of evening observation. He lowered his gaze from the horizon and focused on the garden itself. The late light, a deep, liquid gold, painted the worn stone walls a warm russet. Every leaf, every stalk of lavender, every droplet of moisture clinging to the sage seemed to hold a small, trembling lamp within it. This was the moment of revelation, when the world paused and showed its true, soft-edged beauty. Elias began his slow walk back toward the cloister, his worn leather sandals making only the faintest scuff on the flagstones. His steps were measured, his breathing deep and even. Inhaled the cool air, exhaled the day's labor. He repeated this silent rhythm, a simple prayer of the body. The air smelled of damp earth and salt, overlaid by the faint, comforting sharpness of wood smoke drifting from the kitchen chimney. It was a scent of permanence, of things that remained steady regardless of the world's clamor. He passed the rose trellis, a structure of aged oak that leaned slightly to the north, bowed by generations of wind and weight. The last of the summer roses, creamy white with centers of soft peach, were tightly closed, already sleeping. Elias paused, not to touch them, but simply to observe their stillness. He remembered the verse he often pondered while tending them. "Be still, and know that I am God." The stillness of a sleeping rose, preparing in silence for the coming light, felt like the purest form of trust. He walked past the central fountain. It was a simple, stone basin where water trickled from the mouth of a sculpted angel, its face worn smooth by time and the constant kiss of the stream. The sound it made was not a splash or a rush, but a quiet, continuous whisper, a sound that erased all other noises from the mind. Drip, whisper, peace. The water pooled, clear and cool, reflecting the last sliver of blue from the western sky. Brother Elias felt the familiar, gentle ache in his knees and the slow pull in his shoulders. It was a welcome ache, the sign of a day well spent, of energy given wholly to the creation and preservation of beauty. He was not a man of grand sermons or theological argument. His faith was expressed in the turning of the soil, the pruning of the vine, the patient waiting for growth. He reached the sheltered bench beneath the ancient olive tree, the tree that tradition claimed was planted by the Abbey's founder 7 centuries ago. The bark was thick, furrowed, and silvery gray, sheltering a space where the air always felt warmer, heavier with history and grace. Elias sat, placing his hands on his lap, palms up. He watched the final curtain of light draw across the valley below. In the distance, across the valley floor, he could just make out the few scattered lamps of the nearest village. They seemed like tiny, hesitant pinpricks, fragile against the growing dark. He thought of the people down there, concluding their complex days of commerce, family, and worry. He sent a silent, breath-held prayer toward those lights, a blessing of rest and renewal. The transition from dusk to twilight was now complete. The world had turned from gold to indigo. The details of the garden were no longer distinct, but merged into deep, comforting shapes. The dark mass of the hedges, the gentle silhouette of the cypress trees pointing toward the emerging stars. Elias closed his eyes for a moment, letting his inner vision take over. He saw not the plants, but the structure of their life beneath the soil, the quiet, ceaseless work of roots finding nourishment, drawing strength from the hidden reservoirs. He often thought of the parable of the sower. The true miracle was not the scattering of the seed, but the secret, patient tenacity of the seed once it was buried. The seed must know the dark before it sees the light. This thought was a cornerstone of his understanding of faith. It was in the necessary, rich darkness that the deep work was done, the breaking open, the reaching down, the gathering of strength for the climb. The periods of waiting, of uncertainty, of deep night, these were the most fertile times. He opened his eyes and looked up. The first star had appeared, a brilliant, unwavering point above the spire of the chapel. It was Arcturus, he believed, or perhaps Vega, a star he had watched rise and fall over thousands of nights. The sea now made a low, sustained hum against the cliffs, a sound that was both vast and intimate. It was a sound that told of eternity, of something far greater than any single human life, yet always present, always listening. A gentle breeze stirred, carrying the coolness of the deep ocean. Elias felt a profound sense of gratitude, not for specific gifts, but for the overarching gift of existence, of place, and of the steady, loving presence he felt here in the quiet corner of the world. He rose slowly, his old joints protesting softly, and began the final, shortest part of his evening journey, the walk to the chapel for the final compline service. He left the garden gate unlatched, not out of carelessness, but as an act of quiet trust, a symbolic invitation for any who needed the peace it offered. The world was resting. The earth was silent. Brother Elias was ready for the night. The moon, just past half full, had begun its quiet ascent, a silver coin rising above the eastern hills, promising light even in the deepest hours of the night. His footsteps were the last sound, measured and fading, as he turned toward the sanctuary. The light within the chapel, a warm, golden stain against the ancient stone, seemed to call him home. The cold stone of the cloister walk offered a profound contrast to the lingering warmth of the garden soil. Brother Elias moved through the arched passages, the darkness here deeper and more enclosed than the soft twilight outside. The air was cool, carrying the faint, clean scent of old lime mortar and beeswax polish. The cloister was the heart of the Abbey's architecture, a square of sheltered contemplation surrounding a simple grassy quad. It was where the brothers walked in silence, recited their hours, and carried their burdens in quiet communion. Tonight, it felt like the deep, restful chest of the Abbey, inhaling the sea breeze and holding the silence. Elias focused on the texture beneath his feet, the slight unevenness of the stones, polished by centuries of passing feet. Each footfall was a reminder of the thousands who had walked this path before him, seeking the same solace, praying the same prayers. He was a small, temporary link in a long, unbroken chain of stillness and devotion. He reached the heavy oak door of the chapel. A single, tall candle burned steadily inside a niche just beside the entrance, its flame unwavering despite the draft. It cast long, dancing shadows of the door's iron hinges onto the wall, turning the simple hallway into a canvas of shifting shapes and gentle light. He pushed the door inward. It was stiff, moving with a quiet, satisfying groan, a familiar sound, a greeting. Inside, the chapel was already dim, illuminated only by a few oil lamps and the constant, eternal red glow of the sanctuary lamp, hanging suspended before the altar. That small, persistent light, burning always, was the truest symbol of the Abbey's faith, a humble, constant presence, never extinguished. The few remaining brothers were already seated in the choir stalls. They were men aged by prayer and work, their faces gentle and accustomed to silence. They sat erect, robes pooling around them, each a solid column of rest. There was Brother Thomas, whose quiet laughter tended the bees, and Father Abbot Michael, whose heavy sighs often revealed the weight of his spiritual stewardship. Elias slid into his usual stall. The wood was cold and smooth beneath his hands. He settled in, allowing his body to find its posture of rest. He closed his eyes, and the final noises of the day, the settling of the stone, the soft cough of a brother, the rustle of a heavy robe, faded away. The service of compline, the final prayer of the day, began. It was known as the night office, a time to surrender the day's worries and entrust the coming night to the divine care. The abbot's voice, low and resonant, began the reading. The Lord Almighty grant us a quiet night and a perfect end. The collective response of the few voices, one smoothed by repetition, was barely above a whisper. The psalm chosen for the evening was one Elias knew by heart, the words a gentle tide washing over his tired mind. He didn't focus on the meaning of each word, but on the comforting sound of the language, the slow, meditative cadence of the ancient text. It was a cradle song of faith. In peace, I will both lie down and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. The simple phrase repeated in the quiet hall. In peace, lie down and sleep, in safety. These were not intellectual truths, but felt assurances, echoing off the stone walls and settling deep into the quiet spaces of the soul. As the prayers continued, Elias felt his own thoughts slow, smoothing like stones tumbled by a stream. The anxieties of the day, the concerns about the unexpected late frost or the worn tread of his boots, retreated to the edge of his awareness, no longer urgent. He thought instead of the lamp, the sanctuary lamp. It had been lit on the day he took his vows, and it had been burning for nearly 50 years. Generations of care, of refilling the oil, of trimming the wick, had kept that promise of light alive. It was the epitome of the Abbey's vocation, a slow, unceasing attention to a small, vital flame. After the final blessing, the chapel dissolved into profound, living silence. The brothers rose, making no sound, and began to disperse. They left not in haste, but with the quiet dignity of those whose purpose is settled. Elias remained for a moment longer, breathing the heavy, still air of the sanctuary. He bowed deeply toward the altar and then turned, his heart now as quiet as the stone around him. He was the last to leave. He paused at the door, securing the latch with a soft click, and then turned down the long, narrow corridor that led to his cell. This corridor was different from the cloister. It was dark, lit only by the faint light filtering from the distant kitchen or the rising moon outside the high windows. Elias carried a small, brass oil lamp with him now, a personal lantern whose light was just enough to illuminate his immediate path. The lantern's light was a circle of soft, amber warmth thrown onto the flagstones. It did not try to conquer the vast darkness of the hallway, but simply illuminated the next step. Elias understood this perfectly. Faith was not about seeing the entire road ahead, but about having enough light for the present moment. He did not need to see the entire span of the night, only the next footfall. His cell, a small room with a window overlooking the eastern hills, was a study in simplicity. A narrow cot, a rough-hewn wooden desk, a single wooden crucifix carved by a long-gone brother. It held only essentials, allowing the mind to rest, unburdened by possessions. Elias set his brass lamp on the small desk. Its flame flickered momentarily, then steadied. He placed his worn robe on the hook and sat on the edge of the cot. He took a few slow, deep breaths, listening now only to the soft, distant murmur of the sea and the internal silence of his own heart. The sea sound was a great, steady heartbeat, the rhythm of the timeless world. He looked out the window. The moon was higher now, a white pearl against the deep, star-strewn velvet of the sky. The stars, countless and silent, spoke of a grandeur that dwarfed all human striving, a vast, complex order governed by love. Before extinguishing the lamp, Elias performed his last act of the day, a small ritual of reading. He opened his small, much-handled book of prayers, not to a new lesson, but to a familiar passage from the Gospels, the Beatitudes, the blessings of the humble. He read the words slowly, soundlessly, tracing them with his eye. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. He paused at the word peacemakers. It was not a grand call to halt wars, but a quiet reminder of the daily, inner work required to cultivate peace within oneself, to be a small source of calm in a restless world. The garden was his peace, the quiet act of surrender to God's order. He closed the book. The message was complete. The day was done. Elias reached for the lamp. With a gentle exhale, he pinched the wick, extinguishing the small flame. The darkness that enveloped the room was not empty, but full. It was the dense, restful, nourishing darkness of the sleeping earth, the darkness where seeds wait and rest is deep. He slid under the rough blanket. His mind remained quiet, settled. As he drifted toward sleep, His last conscious thought was of the Abbey itself, standing silent and steady on the cliff, a small, humble beacon entrusted to the care of a vast and loving providence. The work was finished. The night was safe. Sleep came then, like a gentle, cool wave washing him onto the silent shore of rest. The simple phrase repeated in the quiet hall: "In peace, lie down and sleep, in safety." These were not intellectual truths, but felt assurances, echoing off the stone walls and settling deep into the quiet spaces of the soul. As the prayers continued, Elias felt his own thoughts slow, smoothing like stones tumbled by a stream. The anxieties of the day, the concerns about the unexpected late frost or the worn tread of his boots, retreated to the edge of his awareness, no longer urgent. He thought instead of the lamp, the sanctuary lamp. It had been lit on the day he took his vows, and it had been burning for nearly 50 years. Generations of care, of refilling the oil, of trimming the wick, had kept that promise of light alive. It was the epitome of the Abbey's vocation, a slow, unceasing attention to a small, vital flame. After the final blessing, the chapel dissolved into profound, living silence. The brothers rose, making no sound, and began to disperse. They left not in haste, but with the quiet dignity of those whose purpose is settled. Elias remained for a moment longer, breathing the heavy, still air of the sanctuary. He bowed deeply toward the altar and then turned, his heart now as quiet as the stone around him. He was the last to leave. He paused at the door, securing the latch with a soft click, and then turned down the long, narrow corridor that led to his cell. This corridor was different from the cloister. It was dark, lit only by the faint light filtering from the distant kitchen or the rising moon outside the high windows. Elias carried a small, brass oil lamp with him now, a personal lantern whose light was just enough to illuminate his immediate path. The lantern's light was a circle of soft, amber warmth thrown onto the flagstones. It did not try to conquer the vast darkness of the hallway, but simply illuminated the next step. Elias understood this perfectly. Faith was not about seeing the entire road ahead, but about having enough light for the present moment. He did not need to see the entire span of the night, only the next footfall. His cell, a small room with a window overlooking the eastern hills, was a study in simplicity. A narrow cot, a rough-hewn wooden desk, a single wooden crucifix carved by a long-gone brother. It held only essentials, allowing the mind to rest, unburdened by possessions. Elias set his brass lamp on the small desk. Its flame flickered momentarily, then steadied. He placed his worn robe on the hook and sat on the edge of the cot. He took a few slow, deep breaths, listening now only to the soft, distant murmur of the sea and the internal silence of his own heart. The sea sound was a great, steady heartbeat, the rhythm of the timeless world. He looked out the window. The moon was higher now, a white pearl against the deep, star-strewn velvet of the sky. The stars, countless and silent, spoke of a grandeur that dwarfed all human striving, a vast, complex order governed by love. Before extinguishing the lamp, Elias performed his last act of the day, a small ritual of reading. He opened his small, much-handled book of prayers, not to a new lesson, but to a familiar passage from the Gospels, the Beatitudes, the blessings of the humble. He read the words slowly, soundlessly, tracing them with his eye. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. He paused at the word peacemakers. It was not a grand call to halt wars, but a quiet reminder of the daily, inner work required to cultivate peace within oneself, to be a small source of calm in a restless world. The garden was his peace, the quiet act of surrender to God's order. He closed the book. The message was complete. The day was done. Elias reached for the lamp. With a gentle exhale, he pinched the wick, extinguishing the small flame. The darkness that enveloped the room was not empty, but full. It was the dense, restful, nourishing darkness of the sleeping earth, the darkness where seeds wait and rest is deep. He slid under the rough blanket. His mind remained quiet, settled. As he drifted toward sleep, his last conscious thought was of the Abbey itself, standing silent and steady on the cliff, a small, humble beacon entrusted to the care of a vast and loving providence. The work was finished. The night was safe. Sleep came then, like a gentle, cool wave washing him onto the silent shore of rest. The night deepened around Brother Elias, settling into the profound quiet known only to stone walls and sleeping fields. His sleep was not one of turmoil, but of stillness, a reflection of the ordered, disciplined peace he sought during his waking hours. It was the deep rest promised in the Psalms, a surrender to the stillness of the divine embrace. He did not dream in pictures or drama, but in sensations, the gentle warmth of the blanket, the distant, muffled sound of the sea, which, in the silence, seemed to be breathing in and out, a massive, rhythmic lung of the world. He felt the cold permanence of the Abbey stone against the warmth of his small cell. He was anchored, held fast against the flow of time. In the hour just before the first hint of dawn, that time known as vigils, Elias stirred. It was not the abrupt awakening of worry, but the natural, gentle rising of a body accustomed to the rhythm of prayer and earth. The darkness in the room was absolute, yet he knew precisely where he was and what surrounded him. He lay for a long moment, simply listening. The Abbey was silent, utterly hushed. Even the wind seemed to have rested its wings. This was the quietest hour of the 24, the nadir of activity, the time when all things were most deeply immersed in their own essence. In the Christian tradition, this hour held a sacred significance. It was the time of waiting, of watching, the time before the resurrection of light. Elias found a deep comfort in this expectant silence. It reminded him that profound change and renewal often begin not in a burst of noise, but in the deepest quiet. He shifted slightly on his cot. The rough fabric of the wool blanket rasped softly, a tiny, momentary disturbance swallowed instantly by the vast silence. Elias began his morning prayer while still lying down, whispering the ancient words only in his mind. He offered gratitude for the night's rest and asked for guidance for the day ahead. His prayer was simple, agrarian. He prayed for the health of the soil, for the resilience of the roots, and for the purity of the water that fed the Abbey. He prayed to be a faithful keeper, a steward of the small patch of the world entrusted to his care. He thought of the seeds buried in the winter soil. They were resting now, undergoing the slow, secret process of transformation, taking in the cold moisture, gathering the potential for life. They were entirely dependent on the faithful rhythm of the seasons, the unchangeable promise of spring. Their trust was absolute. This was the lesson the garden taught him every day. Trust the process that is hidden, that you cannot rush or force. Trust the dark hours as much as the light. He sat up slowly, easing his legs over the side of the cot. He felt the chill of the floorboards beneath his feet, a shock of cold that was grounding. Elias did not light his lamp. He did not need it yet. His eyes, long accustomed to the darkness, could discern the faint outline of the window, a pale rectangle in the wall. He moved to the small wooden desk and took up the book of prayers he had closed the night before. This time, he didn't read, but simply held the book, feeling the texture of its worn leather cover. The shape of it settled perfectly into his palm. It was a tangible connection to the history of his faith, a physical object imbued with thousands of hours of quiet devotion. He stood by the window, peering out toward the eastern sky. There was still no light, but he knew the moment was near. He could feel the slight, subtle shift in the temperature, the very faintest hint of purple mixing with the indigo. The darkness was beginning to thin, like heavy cream being dissolved into water. He stood sentinel, a silent, humble witness to the coming dawn. In this moment of deep waiting, Elias felt closest to the heart of the Christian mystery, the promise of light returning after absolute darkness, the certainty of resurrection after the long burial. It was a macrocosm of the daily cycle, played out in the fields, the seeds, and the rising sun. A soft, almost imperceptible sound broke the silence. It was the first call of a lone gull, already awake and riding the early currents of air over the cliff. It was a sharp, clear, yet gentle sound, the signal that the world was beginning to turn again. Elias gave a quiet sigh of peace, a sound of release. The long night was over. The grace of the new day was approaching. He turned away from the window, knowing that soon the first, faint bell would ring, calling the brothers to matins, the morning office, and beginning the cycle of work and worship anew. He would dress now, fetch his heavy boots, and prepare to meet the day's demands, the damp soil, the thirsty roots, the quiet labor that was his life's true prayer. The peace of the night was not forgotten, but carried forward, a secret wellspring of strength for the coming light. The silence of the deep night was finally broken by a sound as old as the Abbey itself, the gentle, measured toll of the matins bell. It was not a harsh clang, but a low, hollow resonance, carried on the air currents, passing from the belfry to the cloisters and settling over the sleeping fields. The bell was an auditory cue for the faithful, a soft instruction: rise, the light is coming. Brother Elias was already dressed in his heavy woolen habit and boots. He moved to the door of his cell, the slow, familiar movements requiring no thought. He was operating in the deep muscle memory of routine, which, for him, was a form of restful meditation. He joined the procession of brothers in the dark hallway. They walked single file, moving toward the chapel. No one spoke. The only sounds were the soft, rhythmic brushing of their habits against the stone walls and the steady, collective thud of their sandals. It was a movement of unity, a silent river of shared purpose flowing toward the altar. Inside the chapel, the atmosphere had shifted subtly since Compline. The air was colder, crisper, and the small oil lamps seemed to burn with a slightly more intense, eager flame. The brothers settled into their stalls. The matin service was longer than Compline, filled with readings, long psalms, and hymns of anticipation for the new day. It was a time dedicated to renewal, repentance, and the acceptance of the day's work as an offering. Father Abbot Michael's voice, now clearer and stronger than it had been at night, began the service. The readings spoke of creation and providence, the sun rising, the earth yielding its bounty, the unfailing mercy that is new every morning. Elias listened, his eyes occasionally drifting toward the eastern windows, which were slowly changing from black to a luminous, pale gray. With every psalm sung, the promise of the external world seemed to grow stronger. His favorite part was the recitation of the Te Deum, a great ancient hymn of praise. The voices rose in a soft swell, lifting the weight of the night and welcoming the light. The rhythm was slow, hypnotic, and utterly grounding. We praise Thee, O God, we acknowledge Thee to be the Lord. As the final benediction was given, the sun was just beginning to touch the highest pane of the stained glass window above the altar. A single, thin shaft of brilliant white light pierced the darkness, momentarily turning the dust motes in the air into glittering gold. It was a moment of profound beauty, the daily, physical manifestation of grace breaking into the humble space of stone and wood. The service complete, Elias did not linger. His prayer was about to move from the chapel to the field. He gave a brief nod to Brother Thomas, and then made his way out of the abbey and back toward the garden. The world outside had been completely transformed. The indigo darkness was gone, replaced by the cool, ethereal blue of dawn. The air had a sharp, invigorating freshness. The garden was coated in dew. It was everywhere, clinging to the spider webs stretched between the lavender bushes, beating on the broad, flat leaves of the cabbage, and saturating the grass. The dew was cold and clean, turning the earth into a surface of silent, brilliant jewels. Elias stopped, taking his first deep breath of the morning air. He noticed that the scents were different now. The salt air was sharper, and the underlying earthy scent of the soil was mixed with the delicate fragrance of newly opened herbs, mint, rosemary, and thyme, all refreshed by the night's cooling. His first task was one of simple, attentive presence, walking the paths. He needed to survey the garden not for work, but for observation. Had the wind done any damage? Had any early pests begun their destructive work? More importantly, he needed to observe the state of the living things. He walked past the berry bushes. The late raspberries were still tight, but the dew made them shine like rubies. He saw a tiny sparrow hopping near the compost heap, busily sifting through the remains of yesterday's kitchen scraps. The garden was a microcosm of life, a place of constant, quiet consumption and creation. Elias came to the patch of newly sown wheat, a small section reserved for the Abbey's own bread. He knelt down, ignoring the cold dampness that immediately soaked into his boots and the knees of his habit. He ran his fingers lightly over the surface of the soil. It was cool and yielding but firm. The seeds, recently buried, were invisible, but their presence was certain. He felt a deep connection to this patch of earth. It held a future promise, a promise that required only patience and care to be fulfilled. He remembered the words he had heard in the chapel moments before. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain. But if it dies, it produces much fruit. The dying was not an end, but a necessary step toward proliferation. The darkness, the burial, the stillness, these were the fertile stages. His own life, quiet and seemingly unchanging, felt like this grain, buried in the routine of the Abbey, dying to worldly ambition, yet constantly ready to yield fruit in the form of peace and steady service. He rose slowly. The sun had finally cleared the eastern ridge, casting long, sharp shadows. The deep gold light touched the Abbey walls and flooded the garden. The dewdrops, moments ago silent jewels, now sparkled violently, catching fire in the light. The day had truly begun. Elias picked up his basket and pruning shears from the small tool shed. His work for the morning would be to weed the lettuce beds, a meticulous, focused task that required patience and attention to detail. The keeper of the quiet garden was ready to begin his daily prayer of labor, a sustained act of faith placed between the silent earth and the boundless sky. Brother Elias reached the long, rectangular beds where the Abbey's winter lettuce was growing. They were young, their pale green leaves tightly furrowed, resting close to the earth. They represented purity and simplicity, a fragile promise of cool, crisp meals in the months ahead. His work was weeding, a task that required silence, stillness, and immense precision. He knelt down at the end of the first bed, placing his small basket and his short, blunt weeding fork beside him. The ground was cold and slightly yielding beneath his thick habit, but the warmth of the sun, now fully visible and rising quickly, began to settle warmly on his back. He began. This work was not about speed, it was about attention. He knew that the true danger lay not in the visible leaf of the weed, but in the unseen root, deep and tenacious, often winding itself inextricably around the roots of the lettuce. Elias focused his gaze on a small, purple-leafed bindweed, barely an inch tall, yet already sending its fine, white threads down into the soil. He carefully inserted the weeding fork into the earth about an inch away from the bindweed's stem. He pushed gently, levering the soil, easing the earth away from the lettuce root without tearing the delicate structure. The sound of the fork scraping the soil was soft, a small, rhythmic ship, a sound of quiet surgery. When the soil was loose, Elias used his thumb and forefinger to grasp the weed as close to the ground as possible. He did not pull quickly, which would snap the stem and leave the root intact, but slowly, with sustained, even pressure, waiting for the whole intricate system to surrender. Ease, patience, persistence. These were the virtues demanded by the bindweed. Finally, with a soft, tearing sound, the weed came free, a small, slender white root, longer than the visible stem, sometimes entangled with small pebbles or grains of sand. He examined it briefly, confirming the taproot was whole, and then dropped the weed into his basket. The root of the matter is removed, he thought, a phrase that always echoed in his mind during this labor. Elias had always found a deep, meditative parallel between the garden work and the work of the soul. The weeds were the small, persistent habits, the minor selfish inclinations, the unnecessary anxieties that threatened to choke the true growth of faith and kindness. They started small, easy to ignore, but if allowed to thrive, their root systems became impossible to disentangle without damaging the essential good. The work taught him humility. Just as he believed he had cleared a patch perfectly, a tiny, overlooked sprout would emerge the next day, evidence that his attention had wavered. The fight for purity, whether of the soil or the spirit, was never finished. He worked through the beds, inch by inch. The world outside the square of earth he focused on seemed to dissolve. There was only the cool, dark soil, the vibrant green of the lettuce, the small intrusion of the weed, and the rhythmic action of his hands. The sun climbed higher, warming the air. Elias felt the stiff warmth spreading through his bones, chasing away the remnants of the night's chill. A bumblebee, newly awakened, began its slow, heavy patrol over the nearby patch of flowering basil, its deep, drowsy hum a soothing contrast to the silence of the rest of the garden. From the Abbey kitchen, 100 yards away, Elias began to hear the faint, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of brother cook kneading the day's bread dough. It was another sound of life and purposeful labor, a parallel action of hands working with basic ingredients, flour, water, yeast, to bring forth sustenance, just as Elias worked with soil, seed, and water. Mid-morning had arrived, the time when the light was clearest and the shadows sharpest. Elias straightened his back, stretching out the stiffness, and gazed out over the garden. He had cleared one full bed. The lettuce stood now, surrounded by clean, dark soil, ready to draw nourishment without competition. They looked stronger, more peaceful, having been freed from the struggle. Elias stood for a moment, simply appreciating the work of his hands, not as a measure of his skill, but as a testimony to the patience of God, who waits for us, season after season, to clear the weeds from our own hearts. He picked up his tools, moved to the edge of the next bed, and knelt again, ready to return to the quiet, vital work of the root. The day was long, and the garden required endless attention. The morning had peaked, yielding its cool, sharp air to the steady, diffused warmth of midday. Elias had finished his work on the lettuce beds, leaving behind long, clean furrows of dark earth where only the purposeful green of the winter leaves remained. He gathered his tools, dusted the soil from his hands, and stood for a moment, basking in the light. He heard the bell again, not the solemn toll of matins, but the quick, cheerful chime announcing the midday office of none. The rhythmic, cheerful ding-dong was a reminder to pause, to lift the heart from the earth toward the heavens, even in the middle of strenuous work. Elias did not join the brothers in the chapel for this short office. For the keeper of the ground, the rhythm of work sometimes necessitated a private prayer, a silent observance in the field itself. He turned his face toward the sound of the bell, closed his eyes, and recited the simple, ancient prayer of the hour. O God, make speed to save us. O Lord, make haste to help us. This brief, conscious break was crucial. It ensured that the labor did not become mere toil, but remained an act of worship, a continuous meditation interwoven with the physical demand. With the prayer complete, Elias moved on to his next task, tending to the ancient olive tree. This tree was more than just a plant. It was a living relic, a witness. Its roots ran deep under the courtyard stones, and its trunk was gnarled and spiraled, appearing less like wood and more like solidified time. Its silver-green leaves rustled in a constant, low whisper, a sound that always suggested quiet secrets and patient endurance. Elias approached the tree with reverence. He carried a bucket filled with rich, dark mulch, a mixture of aged compost and pine needles, which he intended to spread around the tree's vast base. The mulch served two purposes: to retain moisture and to gently feed the roots hidden beneath the surface. He knelt down at the edge of the root flare, the point where the trunk widens as it meets the ground. He began scooping the mulch with his hands, laying it down in a thick, insulating blanket around the base. The mulch was soft, yielding, and smelled faintly of moss and deep, cool earth. His movements were deliberate, slow arcs of his arms, scattering the dark material evenly. As he worked, he thought of the biblical symbolism of the olive tree: peace, endurance, and the constant provision of oil, the light that sustained the sanctuary lamp. The true lesson of the olive tree, Elias mused, was patience. An olive tree does not rush its growth. It takes centuries to become truly magnificent. It can endure drought, frost, and fire, yet it continues to yield its fruit year after year. It taught him the profound value of persistence in quiet service. It taught him that the most durable and valuable things in life are often those that require the longest time to mature. He remembered the gospel story of Christ praying among the olive trees in Gethsemane, the oil press. It was under the patient watch of trees like this one that the deepest human struggle, the struggle to submit to the divine will, had taken place. The strength for that submission, Elias believed, was drawn from the same deep source that sustained the roots of the olive tree: faith in the hidden goodness of the soil. Elias finished laying the mulch. He then turned his attention to the lower branches. These branches were old, brittle, and often crossed, rubbing against each other and wasting the tree's energy. Pruning was essential, a necessary removal of the old to allow the new light and air to penetrate. He took his heavy, well-oiled pruning shears. They opened and closed with a satisfying, sharp snick. He chose a dead branch, twisted and dry, and applied the blade. Snick! The branch fell softly onto the mulch. He continued slowly, selecting only those parts that were clearly spent or obstructive. The pruning was an act of mercy, not violence, a purification intended to promote life. He was clearing away the distractions, allowing the central, fruitful branches to draw their full measure of sun and air. Elias felt a moment of deep connection to the tree, recognizing its struggle and its tenacity. Like the tree, his own life had endured many seasons, times of fruitfulness and times of drought. The wisdom he had now was the accumulated result of enduring those cycles. He looked up through the canopy of silvery leaves. The sun was directly overhead, dappling the courtyard in shifting patterns of bright light and cool shadow. The gentle breeze whispered through the leaves, a sound that felt like the earth's own steady breathing. The work was restful because it was necessary, and it was necessary because it served the quiet glory of God's creation. The tree was nurtured, the earth was mulched, and Brother Elias was nourished, both in body and spirit, by the simple rhythm of care. The midday sun hung high, casting its shortest, starkest shadows. The Abbey bell chimed again, a slower, more deliberate sequence this time, calling the brothers from their individual labors to the common table for the main meal of the day, sext, or midday dinner. Elias washed his hands thoroughly at the stone basin near the garden shed, scrubbing away the deep stains of mulch and soil. The water was cold and refreshing, a small, invigorating shock to his skin. He dried his hands on a rough linen cloth, feeling the texture of the fabric, a small, familiar comfort. He walked across the cloister and entered the refectory. It was a long, plain hall, cool even on the warmest days, with high, vaulted ceilings that held the quiet air. Along the walls, sturdy wooden tables were set simply with bowls, wooden spoons, and small, rough linen napkins. The brothers took their places along the benches. There was no conversation. Silence was observed during meals, a practice intended to focus the mind on the nourishment being received and to keep the heart free from distraction. Instead of conversation, one of the younger brothers, Brother Joseph, stood at a small pulpit and began to read aloud from a religious text. The gentle, rhythmic monotone of the reader's voice filled the hall, making the words less a matter of active debate and more a background rhythm for meditation. Elias bowed his head as the abbot gave the brief blessing over the food, thanking Providence for the bounty of the earth and the hands that prepared it. The meal was simple, restorative, and almost entirely sourced from the Abbey's own grounds. Thick, dark bread baked that morning by Brother Cook, a hearty, warm lentil stew, and a large bowl of the Abbey's crisp, homegrown lettuce, dressed simply with olive oil pressed from the old tree. Elias ate slowly, deliberately. Each spoonful of the stew was warm and savory, a perfect balance of salt and herb. He focused on the texture of the bread, crusty on the outside and soft within, and the clean, slightly bitter taste of the olive oil. This was eating as an act of awareness, not hurried consumption. He reflected on the simplicity of the meal. In the garden, he worked to remove the weeds that choked the essential plant. Here, the meal itself was free of the weeds of extravagance or unnecessary complexity. It was pure sustenance, a mirror of the simple, true life the Abbey sought to cultivate. He listened to the reader's voice, which spoke this day of the parable of the vineyard workers, a story about labor, time, and the grace of the master who paid the same wage to all, regardless of the length of their toil. Elias found this parable deeply comforting. His own life was a long, slow, steady toil, beginning at Maddens and ending at Compline. He did not seek recognition or a grand reward. He simply sought to be among those who showed up and worked until the sun went down. The lesson of the parable was that the value of the labor rested entirely in the grace of the giver, not the merit of the worker. When the meal concluded, the silence was broken only by the scraping of benches as the brothers rose to depart. Elias then returned to his cell for the customary hour of rest, known as the siesta or merides, a pause intended to preserve energy for the long afternoon ahead. The sun, having reached its apex, was now beginning its slow, predictable decline. The light pouring through his small, unadorned window was brilliant but softened by the deep shadow of the high ceiling. He stretched out on his cot, not to sleep deeply, but to hover at the threshold of rest, allowing his mind to remain aware while his body recovered. He closed his eyes. The silence here was different from the silence of the night. It was the silence of held breath, of intense quietude under the midday sun. All the sounds of morning, the birds, the kitchen bustle, the sharp snick of the pruning shears, were temporarily suspended. Elias felt the deep, restorative weight of his own body sinking into the cot. He practiced the deliberate release of tension, letting his shoulders relax, smoothing the worry lines from his brow, allowing his hands, still faintly smelling of earth, to rest fully open. In this deep, quiet pause, he experienced a brief moment of pure spiritual peace, a sense of unity with the stillness of the Abbey and the steady, unseen life of the garden. He was ready for the afternoon, ready to return to the earth, refreshed and patient. The long day was only half done, and the promise of evening's final rest felt earned and certain. The hour of rest concluded with a quiet, internalized sigh. Brother Elias rose from his cot, feeling the restoration of the brief siesta ripple through his limbs. The afternoon light, though still bright, had lost the aggressive edge of noon, becoming softer, a pale lemon gold filtering through the small window. The world outside felt slower, draped in a deep, peaceful lassitude. He returned to the garden, where the air was heavy and still. The sun had warmed the stone paths and the dark earth, releasing the deep, earthy, almost sweet smell of warm soil. The silence felt different now, less expectant than the morning, and more settled, a silence of steady, ongoing production. Elias's afternoon task was essential and deeply meditative, tending the ancient, narrow irrigation channels that ran through the vegetable plots. Water was the lifeblood of the Highcliffe garden, and ensuring its steady, deliberate flow was a sacred duty. The Abbey's water source was a natural spring high on the hill behind the main buildings. It was channeled through a series of stone and clay conduits, gravity-fed, bringing a constant, cool trickle to the plots. Elias was responsible for clearing any debris, fallen leaves, pebbles, fine silt, that might obstruct the flow, and ensuring the small clay sluice gates were correctly positioned to direct the water to the thirsty beds. He began at the head of the main channel, a shallow, moss-lined trough carved directly into the flagstone. He moved slowly, his body bent low, his shadow long and thin beside him. He carried a small, flat wooden paddle, worn smooth by years of use, which served as his clearing tool. The sound of the water was the central rhythm of this task. It was not a gushing or roaring sound, but a constant, gentle murmur, a quiet, sustained whisper of movement. Flow, 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 the water seemed to say, an endless, reassuring song. As he cleared a section of the channel, pulling out a trapped leaf or dislodging a tiny blockage, the water's voice would change slightly, a brief gurgle, a fractional increase in speed, before settling back into its tranquil, consistent murmur. Elias saw the water not just as a physical necessity, but as a living symbol of divine grace. Grace, like this water, was always available, constantly flowing, requiring no effort to create, but requiring conscious, humble effort to receive. He had to clear the obstructions, the weeds of distraction and selfishness, to allow the sustenance to reach the thirsty roots of his soul. He knelt beside the lettuce bed he had weeded that morning. The soil was firming up beneath the sun. He carefully adjusted the small clay gate leading to the bed. With a soft, sucking sound, a thin, clear stream of water diverted from the main channel and began to snake its way through the furrow between the young plants. The sight was deeply satisfying. The dark earth immediately darkened further as it absorbed the cool moisture. The water sank quickly, disappearing into the soil, vanishing where it was most needed, leaving behind only the evidence of refreshed, deepened color. The plants would drink their fill slowly, steadily, over the next few hours. Elias paused to watch, his focus entirely on the silent miracle of absorption. The water was working its essential, hidden magic. He spent the remainder of the afternoon progressing along the channels, moving with the patient, unhurried pace of the water itself. From the lettuce, to the cabbages, to the newly tilled plot waiting for winter greens, he ensured that the line of life flowed uninterrupted. The sun began its long, elegant slide toward the west, preparing for the dramatic evening Elias loved so well. The shadows of the Abbey buildings stretched longer and longer, providing welcome coolness over the plots. As the light softened, Elias heard the faint, distant sound of the bell ringing again, the call to vespers, the evening prayer. It was a sound that marked the beginning of the end of the day's work. Elias gathered his tools. He left the water running slowly, faithfully, knowing its work would continue long after he had retired for the night. The garden was hydrated, the paths were clear, and his heart was quiet. The day, like the channel he had cleared, had flowed well. The call to vespers, the sunset prayer, was a sound Brother Elias cherished above all others. It was a signal of completion, a peaceful drawing in of the spirit as the light of the world was drawn away. The bell's tone was deep and mellow, a sound that seemed to carry the promise of rest on its vibrations. He made his way back through the garden, moving toward the Abbey structure. The plots he had just watered looked dark and satisfied, the air around them cool and heavy with moisture. The shadows, which moments ago had been long and stretching, were now blurring, merging into a uniform haze of evening purple. Elias stopped at the corner of the herb garden. Before joining the brothers, he performed a small, personal ritual. He selected a few sprigs of lavender, just past their peak bloom, and 2 or 3 pale leaves of lemon balm. These were his evening offering, a fragrant tribute to the day's work, which he would place on the communal washstand. He gathered them carefully, gently pinching the stems so as not to tear them, allowing the deep, calming scent of the lavender to release into the cool air. The simple act of collecting and appreciating the herbs was a final, humble prayer of thanks for the earth's bounty. All things flow from thee, and of thine own have we given thee. He entered the chapel just as the first hymn began. Vespers was the office of light, celebrated as the light failed, focused on the theme of Christ as the eternal, unquenchable light in the darkening world. The windows of the chapel, facing west and south, were awash in the dying glow of the sun. The light was no longer clear and piercing, but soft, warm, and highly saturated, a final, burning palette of orange, rose, and gold. The stone walls, which had been gray all day, now seemed infused with a transient, glorious color. Elias joined in the singing of the Magnificat, Mary's song of praise, which was always recited at vespers. The collective voices of the brothers were a comfort, a sound of shared expectation and gentle humility. He has filled the hungry with good things, and sent the rich away empty. The words resonated deeply with Elias, the keeper of the ground. He saw the wisdom of providence laid out in the garden. The soil demanded humble, patient labor, yet it rewarded that labor with a fullness far beyond expectation. The arrogance of the rich, those who believe they can force or rush the earth, was always met with failure. Only the hungry, the patient, and the meek were truly filled. As the prayers concluded, the sun disappeared entirely below the horizon. The chapel light transitioned instantly from the burning colors of sunset to the soft, enduring glow of the internal oil lamps. It was a powerful, daily reminder that while the light of the sun departs, the light of faith remains, constant and provided. After the service, Elias made his way back to the cloister. The air was now distinctly cool, carrying the sharp dampness of the approaching night. The moon, hidden earlier in the day, was beginning to assert its presence, bathing the courtyard in a silvery, detached light. He walked toward the great well, an ancient stone circle built centuries ago to draw water from the deepest part of the spring's catchment. He paused at the edge, placing his hands on the cold, smooth coping stone.